Hey guys, welcome back to the OPD podcast with Joe and Austin. We have a very special guest today that I've been very much looking forward to having on. Dr. Christopher Matthews. Is that the full name? I haven't missed any accreditations off of there.
Well, no, but that's fine, but I have to use my R, my initial, because in America was a famous Chris Matthews. In England, there's a bunch of us. So I moved to Christopher. I realised that wasn't enough. So now I'm Christopher R. Matthews for my work, but Chris or Christopher's fine.
Beautiful. So admittedly, Rick, I apologise. I know Rick's probably listening. I stole your guest, but me and my wife listened to your podcast with the boys from Strom the other day and really, really enjoyed it. And I was hoping that we could get you on here and we wouldn't put you through the contingency of don't talk sciencey or any of that. I'd like to hear the nuts and bolts and the science of pretty much a similar line of what you were talking about on there.
Yeah.
So you want to intro yourself and what you do and stuff like that for the listeners, and then we'll go from there maybe.
Yeah, I think to start with that, if people do go and catch that podcast, it was what's it called, the Stromcast, number 11 or something. If they catch that, I think they'll get some of the stuff that we'll maybe go over again, but maybe go a little bit more detail. We'll see. So Christopher Matthews. I'm basically a sociologist who has been involved in sport all his life, and in one of the messages that we had when we were talking about this, you talked about me as the expert. I'm definitely not an expert within this area, what we're going to talk about today. But this is something that I teach a lot. So I quite like teaching about what I tend to teach is violence, pain and injury, drug use, and broadly kind of stuff that we might head under deviancy in sport. From a kind of sociological perspective, using social science to try and pick out some of the ideas which usually help people think a little bit differently about this sort of stuff. My main research area is boxing, has been. I think I'm probably going to move more and more in towards drugs. I'm at Nottingham Trent University. I've got a website that people should maybe check out if they want to see all my research. That's immersiveresearch.co.uk. Nice little plug early on, that's good. Lots of research, all the stuff that I might talk about today, any of my research is up there, and there's a few blog posts and a few other bits and bobs, and people can learn about the kind of methodology that I use, which we'll probably get on to talk about as well a little bit. So yeah, something a little bit different maybe to the stuff that you normally have on the podcast.
Yeah, definitely. Although we did kind of do one more recently along the lines of outside of the physiological realm, and it had a good response, and I'm trying to sort of explore that road a bit more. So hence us asking you to come on. So yeah, it's really cool. So sociological or sociology practices, for those of us that don't know what that maybe means specifically, could you give us a brief rundown of the basics of that whole topic area, and maybe what it is that you have researched in the past?
So study of society is the best way to capture it. And society is made up of people and groups and communities. So it's then the study of people, behaviors, and then it kind of can move into social psychology, where you start to kind of get into the individual behaviors. And then obviously the gap starts to blur into psychology, but I'm very much on the kind of the sociology side. So there'll be some stuff that people will hear and they'll be talking about it and like, that sounds like it touches on psychology, and there's elements of that in what I talk about. My work was, well, I'll give you a little bit of a background. I always played sport. I was never academic at all. And then I realised coaching sport was a bit naff. I was coaching squash, and I'm on court all day, and it was just too much. So I started studying again. And then while I was at university at Loughborough, I just discovered sociology, that it made me think differently. It captured something in my head to some degree. So I ended up doing a PhD in that. And that was in boxing. My prof wanted me to kind of look at sports violence, wanted me to look at rugby, but I was late 20s when I was doing this, and I wanted to do whatever it was that I was going to research. Lucky enough in this kind of science that I'm in, that you can go and live in the community that you're researching, and by doing that, that's part of your data collection. But I can't go at late 20s to start playing rugby, because it just smash me. There's no such thing as a light game of rugby as far as I can imagine. But boxing's quite different. People assume boxing's really brutal, but and I know you've done some MMA practices and stuff, right? And as you know, you could spend an hour in a boxing gym and never touch anyone. You could just be in the mirror practicing techniques and get an amazing workout from it. And so anyway, I basically went and did that. So my career, the last kind of 10 years or so, has been built on developing and publishing that sort of area, sports violence, the difference between quote unquote real violence and sports violence. What are the differences? Where do they blend? Where do they merge? Women in sport. I've edited a book with a colleague of mine, Alex Channon, down at Brighton, about women in combat sport. What else have I done? A bit on men's health as well. A bit about sociology of men's health, mainly boxing, and starting to move. Written one paper on drug use in boxing, or the lack of drug use in boxing, which we may talk about. And then more recently been doing concussion stuff, which kind of came from my own problems with getting hit in the head too much, because I wasn't very good at boxing. And funny enough, one of the reasons why I ended up chatting with Rick at Strom was because of Support Max Neuro, because I'd tried a few things in terms of supporting brain function, because I had to stop boxing for a bit and I really wanted to carry on. So I ended up trying CBD, and that worked a bit, but it messed with my sleep and a few other things. And I ended up taking Support Max Neuro. I don't think I'll ever not take it for the rest of my life. I think it's brilliant. But anyway, oh yeah. I've got it here with his Hydra thing. I just got a thing of that Hydra to try. Anyway,
Nice?
Yeah, it's amazing. All of them taste amazing. I love it. I could drink them for days. I just love it. Anyway, enough plugging for him. Anyway, he's doing all right without us plugging his stuff.
Well, that's pretty cool. I think we've got a similar background of experiences. As you say, like, yeah, I'm still involved in MMA. I grew up in boxing gym.
Right.
And I was always into boxing. I do more Filipino boxing now, and also more jiu-jitsu. But what is interesting to me is when I compare that world with the bodybuilding world, how far removed they are, to me, at least in my experience, is really surprising. And something I often think about, because it's a topic brought up, or rather perpetuated by both camps, but you get a very different view, at least in my opinion, of having a foot in each door. And I'd like to know your thoughts on this. And like, it's generally the question of these days, what it means to be a man.
Right.
I find this very topical and interesting how it varies so greatly between those camps in my experience.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing that I'll always say with these sort of things is that when you're in them, you fixate on the differences quite easily. And you see them and you're like, wow, that is just it's diametrically opposite what these people are doing in these spaces. But when you kind of move yourself away from them and you lift up to 40,000 feet, you actually see a lot of commonalities. And I think there's a lot more in common with those spaces than there is different. The same with training practices and all the rest of it. Like, most of it in the end is basically the same, with tinkering around the edges, but people fixate on the edges. So I think with the way that I would look at those spaces, and that's why I can happily talk to you guys today about training, issues with training, maybe drug use, a few other things that I've not done loads of research on, but because I've done research on boxing, because some of the techniques of understanding them are quite useful across the board. So let's go with the kind of idea of this kind of what it means to be a man thing. I talked about this a bit with Rick, and it is a funny one, because gender theory, basically sociology of gender, has become very, very mainstream, and people use some of these terms that have been developed over the last kind of 50 to 100 years, but they use them in quite blasé ways without necessarily understanding some of the nuance of the theory, and it takes years to kind of really fully get to grips with notions about social constructionism and some of these things, and postmodernity and a variety of different stuff. The ideas are relatively simple once you get them, but initially it can be a bit of a challenge, especially because most of us are brought up thinking with STEM, really, with science, technology, and we get that as our language. We don't get social theory when we're at school, usually, unless you've got some sort of really kind of innovative teaching and whatnot. So when you kind of start to get these terms which are from academia and they dispel into popular society, they lose some of their depth and they lose some of their understanding. And then we see people throwing around terms like toxic masculinity, which is something that, again, I touched on with Rick slightly. And I touched on it in a very blasé way, and I batted it out. I hate the term, because the way it's used is really uninformed, The notion that, well, I'll give you one very quick critique of it. There's no such thing as toxic masculinity. There's toxic men. And there's men who do bad things to each other and to women and to everyone else. When you lock that down as something that is abstract, like masculinity, though that's toxic masculinity doing that, it lets the men off the rope. It lets the men, oh, it's not me. That's something I learned. Well, yeah, you did, but you've got to unlearn it, and you've got to be a better person. So that's one of the kind of very quick critiques you can make of those sort of things that hammered at masculinity as a thing that exists outside of men's behaviours. It's men. Yes, there's loads of men who are complete dicks, loads of them. And to just reduce that down to masculinity as some sort of thing is not good enough.
I have a question. So too, when is this like a regional thing too? Because you guys, like, Joe and I have talked about this. The UK is so small compared to the US, right? So we have like all these social, I don't know what you would call them, all these different like social groups and regional type of perspectives and things within our country all over the place, right? And then we also have like our current political climate and like each side viewing things differently, and there's like a wildly vast perception difference from different parts of it. Like some people think, like, you use the word masculinity, and it can be viewed in so many different ways, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me because it really, like you said, you have good people and bad. I mean, essentially you have good people and you have bad people, whether they're male, female, or other, right? It doesn't really matter. But it's just, it all boils down to like this idea of perception of what people perceive as good and bad.
Yeah.
And that's,
sure. Yeah.
And that's where it's changed, because I don't know that men have changed. I think perception has changed, right? In terms of what's good. I guess there's probably has been some societal things that have changed. If anything, if you want to use the term masculinity, I think we probably have less of it than we did. If you want to go by like the roughneck type of working class, male, and so on and so forth. And because societal like norms have changed, and females now have different roles that they may not have had, X amount of years ago and stuff. So it's just interesting to me. It's like the whole perception of what a man should be has changed so much.
Yeah, and what you've got is this kind of fluidity that's kind of moved into it, and you hear about people talking about the fluidity of gender, and that's basically what you're talking about. That you can be a man in almost any way you like now, as long as you're not hurting other people. Okay, go get stuck in. We're broadly speaking, your country and our country are very liberal in that respect. Very different in different countries, as you can imagine, especially when religion comes into it. But what you're kind of trying to, I think, grapple with is there is no stable notion of what a man should be, which there used to be to a greater degree. It was never fully stable, but it was far more clear. And a good example is, if you were a miner 100 years ago, there was a good chance that your son was going to be a miner, as in somebody, not a miner as in a child, a miner as in digs in the ground. And that stability of society has shifted. And yeah, there's some cases of that, but very, very rarely. And at the same time, if you were a miner and your son was going to go down the mine, you know what your wife would have done? She would have been at home and she would have been preparing the food. That stability of society has shifted dramatically for in really positive ways in many ways.
Sure,
but
yeah, definitely.
But it has created a fluidity and a flexibility which makes things quite difficult for people, because now there's no like, oh, my dad was a quantity surveyor. I never thought about being a quantity surveyor. I've figured my own path out. And that at times has been a right pain in the arse to figure out what I was going to do with my life. So what it does is it brings this, I don't want to use these terms, I hate using these as well, ontological insecurity. So your ontology, your way of seeing the world becomes insecure. What am I doing? Whereas before it was like, dad's a miner, I'm a miner, my kid's a miner, go. shit life, but it's a life and I don't have to think about it. Now we don't have that. Now we've got to figure it out as we go along. And a lot of people really struggle with that. Some people rise to it and can make an amazing life for themselves in really different ways. And you know, David Beckham can wear, my references are so dated these days. David Beckham can wear a sari or whatever it was, and he's accepted for it all of a sudden. That was groundbreaking back in the day. And that
Austin probably doesn't know who David Beckham is.
I know David Beckham is. Of course I do. Come on.
No one who's listening does.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think that's what you're kind of grappling with, is that kind of shifting and instability. And there's goods and bads with all this stuff. There's positives and negatives from it.
And do you see, in terms of like human behavior, like, in fact, let's stay on like the bodybuilding and boxing thing, because it's,
yeah, let's get into bodybuilding a little bit.
Yeah, so bodybuilding.
That's what I want to talk about.
Yeah, this is a bodybuilding podcaster. Because I can correlate, like, what, because I just noticed you said like there's not a lot of drug use in boxing. Like, there really isn't. I never saw any. Yeah,
so let me just clarify that very quickly. I did a specific project. I've seen drug use in boxing. I did a specific project for Sport England, the national governing body, with amateur boxers. Now, I didn't canvass the whole country. It was immersive work. I was in gyms. I was chatting to people. I was investigating. I had to take some people at their word. I heard very, very little. I heard one rumor about EPO. That's it. The other one was cat, actually, which was something you chew in the Somali community. Has a religious element to it.
AAT.
Yeah, it's a barbiturate or something. So that apparently has some performance-enhancing drugs elements. And then there's obviously recreational drug use, because the lads who are in the boxing gym, mainly lads, mainly from rough working classes, smoke some weed, often come to boxing and stop doing it. However, professional boxing.
Say from my experience, psychedelic use in jiu-jitsu is massive.
Oh, yeah. That's an interesting one. But just on boxing, let me clear that up with the boxing one is professional boxing, like any sports, there's lots of drug use. We know it. People don't like to think it, but it's true. And because of boxing, there's no the testing. You know, like if you ever look at the testing protocols for Mayweather, you know, the biggest star of our time, he was never tested except when he had a contract. And then the testing was on his terms. That's fine. I'm not accusing him of doing drugs. I think he would be one of the people who'd be unlikely, actually, because he was so good he didn't need to. But I know that there's a lot of drugs in boxing. Sorry, I just wanted to clear that up on the kind of boxing bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What was the question?
Well, no, compare that to amateur bodybuilding. Drug use is pretty much not only, well, it's just to be expected, right? It just is.
Yeah, and just to go back to what you said earlier, the kind of dramatic differences between those spaces.
Yes.
Like on what you've just said there, that is completely different. However, well, one thing is that there is a middle ground. I did a lot of my work in a bodybuilding and boxing gym, so there's quite a nice little crossover in some of that, which I might get into. But instead of thinking the evidence of, let's say, no drugs in amateur boxing, yes, probably some, but not much, and let's say lots of drugs in amateur bodybuilding, probably not everyone, but yeah, whatever. Let's take those two opposites. But actually, the thing that probably drives the processes is very similar, and that is the cultural norm within that space. So within that space, it's very, very normal for both people in separate spaces to want to perform as well as possible. Within that space, there are certain people who perform. Sorry, let me start that again. Within that space, there's the group of people who have a set of knowledges that makes their ability to shape performance shaped around that knowledge. So boxing has never had a tradition of doing drugs. If you ask somebody in boxing, which I've done, about drugs, they assume you mean steroids, and it's a weight-controlled sport, so they assume that steroids would be no good for them. And if you ask somebody in bodybuilding, they would assume the opposite, that it's needed, but it's still for performance. It's still driving performance. So the boxers are there, blood, sweat, and tears, training hard, doing things that can be damaging physically for performance. The bodybuilders are in there, blood, sweat, and tears, doing other things that can be damaging for them, again, for performance. So like I said earlier, when you actually go above it, and you don't compare them very closely, but you go above and you oversee the whole culture of sport in and of itself, you can see the similarities between them. that makes some sense.
Mm.
Yeah, it makes sense. Go ahead.
Sorry, go on. You go.
I was going to say it makes sense, but also like there's a different goal with the two, right? Like what's, I think if you look at bodybuilding, they make entire federations based on no drug use or drug use, right? Like they have testing and not testing. So that begs the question, if there was no testing or threat of testing in any type of sport, what would the outcome be? Like, if the Olympics, if they never said there's no testing, everyone knew there was no testing. I know people get around it, obviously, but if they just said they didn't say anything or didn't implement any kind of testing, what would the outcome be? Would just everyone just be loaded to the gills on, like?
I'm not sure anything would change.
Probably not, just because everyone's probably already doing it anyhow.
Yeah. I think that you'd probably see people shift to drugs that don't clear the system, and then systems to make them just be happily in the system.
Right.
Would the volume change? Not necessarily. But yeah, I work this through with the students quite a lot. We have the drug testing sport. Let's do it. Let's do the 100 meters as fast as we can do it, sort of thing. I think you'd probably find, as you know, that the more drugs people do doesn't necessarily make more performance. The smarter drugs, maybe, the more synergies and all that sort of stuff. But like give those athletes more drugs, would they get better? Maybe, I don't know, not necessarily. But yeah, I do work this through with the students to some degree, to try and kind of work through what the future is going to be, especially when you've got to accept that gene doping is going to happen, or is already happening as well. And in effect, you can't catch the people who are taking drugs, because they're always one step ahead of you. By definition, you can't test for a drug you don't know about yet. And there are some ways around that with the biological passport and a few other things. But I have some really nice, interesting debates with the students about this, about the liberalization of it, about also the training that people have to do at the top level, especially in the Tour de France. It's physically unhealthy to do it without drugs. Like the drugs are the thing that's keeping them in the seat. So you take the drugs out of it and they try and perform that way, and they're just going to be destroyed. Like they need something to bolster the testosterone to keep it up to some level. Right. They probably need insulin to be able to recover quickly enough. They probably need, because they haven't got a lot of muscle mass other on the legs. So it's not like they're kind of necessarily like processing all the fuel they need to take in that well. And the EPO they probably need just to be able to survive.
In terms of natural bodybuilding and the fact that they are hypogonadal by the time they reach
there
the
you
state.
go, yeah.
This is a very physiologically unhealthy state. Should PRT even be a mandatory in
totally,
quote unquote natural bodybuilding?
Yeah, but we move into this place, don't we, where there's, and this is what I talked about with Rick quite a lot, this stigma around drug use. And that I always think with natural bodybuilding, I mean, I'm trying to pick my language carefully. I always think with natural bodybuilding that people have this kind of either or, natural or not, and they make it very, very simple. And I remember being a vegetarian for about a week, and just then started eating a bit of meat, but carried on saying I was a vegetarian because I was just a vegetarian. I just had a bit of meat, and I never saw an issue with that, because that's how we live our lives. We basically live our lives with hypocrisy built into it throughout, except when we move into these sort of spaces. We kind of like, oh no, I'm not a smoker. If I have a fag every now and then, I'm still not a smoker. I mean, you can disagree with these ideas. The point is that we move into these like hallowed territories of I'm this, and that's 100%, and it can't change. And that leads us down this problem where people are doing really unhealthy stuff, naturally or unnaturally, whatever, because they've like set themselves in stone as a thing. But actually the rest of our lives, we're hypocritical most of the time. We shouldn't be, we should avoid it, but it's just the nature of human existence to have some hypocritical elements in your life, I think.
Yeah, because if you think there were like these lack of guidelines, because now if you're an enhanced bodybuilder, you said someone, oh yeah, I just use TRT, and they were like, well, you're not enhanced. You know what I mean? They'd be like, well, what are you doing? You know, they would think that that's nothing and that you're doing it wrong, right?
Yeah.
And it's like you said, like placing these guidelines around things. It's the same thing as like we're talking about the masculinity bit, like trying to define something that maybe shouldn't be defined entirely. You know what I mean? Like some of these things, I think some of these things in society, trying to define them too much is almost part of the issue.
Yeah, for sure.
You end up with
locking things down.
Ethical, moral line as well. I've had a consultation with a guy this week, a natural guy, and you know, he was basically asking me how far he can toe the line and still be natural, because we were talking about him being. And he was like, look, I can use your him, but what do you think of this? And I'm like, well, at the end of the day, it's a pretty harsh stimulant that drives a very effective free fatty acid mobilization profile. But yeah, it's legal in your federation. He's like, okay, great, I'll use that. And I'm like, yeah, but you know, you carry such an ethical drive that you say, I'm a natural bodybuilder. But just because someone says this is okay, you just nod and say, okay. It's quite, you know, how people put themselves into an ethical subgroup or a moral, like a morality stance.
And we see it with COVID. Right. We see it with COVID now, and right, you know, some people, I've been told this is okay to do. Who have you been told by? The government. What are they using? Not really science, politics to make that decision. But I'm doing it, and that's it, and I'm sticking to it. And the kind of lack of free thinking and like, okay, is this the correct thing? Like, yeah, the government have said it, and they've now put a £30 fine on it, but is this right for the situation that I'm in? And a good example is old people, really old people who are at risk of dying from it, but are also at risk of dying anyway. Do you want to give one of their last 5 summers on Earth on lockdown? No, let them go out and see their friends. And if they want to smoke and have a beer in the last 5 years of their life, get stuck in. Now, there is the issue of saving the NHS. I understand that. But once the NHS had latency in space, someone's lived 70 years and they know they've got 5 left. Do they need to be on lockdown for a summer of that? I don't know. But we have this, like you say, this is what I do. This is how we do it. I've been told I've got to do that, and that's it. And I hate that sort of mentality. I think it's really a poor way of living life, really. Lack of critical thinking.
Something else I wanted to ask you about, staying on the subject of bodybuilding, in terms of what attracts people to bodybuilding and how we end up with this type of person that is a bodybuilder, that maybe identifies as a bodybuilder. There's a lot of commonalities amongst us. I say us like I'm some kind of bodybuilder, but amongst bodybuilders, there's a very unique personality type. Do you think that is learnt by being around other bodybuilders and mimicry, or do you think that this sport attracts a specific personality type, or maybe is somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, the simple answer is yes. Everything's always a complex mix, and what we need is complex. People are complex, behaviors are complex. Therefore, our ways of understanding them must also be complex. And one of the problems that we have, one of the things that I can probably go through, we've on my meeting, it's only saying 6 minutes left, so we may have to stop and re-coordinate.
We'll start again, yeah.
One of the things that, one of the limitations in academia, in my area, it's slightly different when you're kind of looking at the stuff that I know you get deep into, where you can do an experiment and it's very like quantified with a variable. I'm testing this. You know, this has got to be connected with a million different papers, but once that's it, I've got my one little bit I can do. To try and do that with human behavior is very, very difficult. To try and explain it with one thing, one variable, is almost, well, it's impossible. I mean, that sort of science has been tried and doesn't really exist. So you kind of have to go with multi-level of analysis to try and explain that. I've got an example, actually. I was thinking through an example of something that happened to me, which I can try and do. It's not quite an example that you've set up, which is why do people drawn to bodybuilding. But do you want me to have a quick go at that?
Please do, yeah.
So I train at the gym. I used to train at the gym on the campus. It's a pretty naff gym. Few local lads, few students. No one, as far as I can tell, is doing gear. Maybe 1 or 2 people used to, as far, you know, just the look. And I had one lad come up to me, and I speak to this lad a little bit. And he just, we've chatted a bit, and I've given him some advice about training, because I've trained for years, and I've used to do personal training, so I don't mind giving a bit of advice and that sort of stuff. And he just starts asking me for steroids. Now, I don't look particularly juicy. You know what I mean? I'm not the guy walking around and people are like, right, ask him. Like, if anything, you like, don't ask him. So, but anyway, he felt like he could ask me about steroids, and we'd had a conversation. So whatever, maybe I'm approachable. I don't think I look approachable, but maybe I do. Whatever. And it just left me thinking, like, why the f is he asking me about steroids? What's his journey? What's going on? My advice to him was, because he obviously, as you can imagine, didn't know anything about anything. So my advice was like, well, don't do that. Go and educate yourself. And I said to him, you know, Dave Crossland, go and look at some of Dave Crossland's stuff. Get some really basic understanding. While you're at it, go and look at the Revive Stronger podcast and get to know training, because he can't squat. So he's asking me for steroids. So how do we understand these? How do we understand these people? And that's what I'll have a quick go at. I've got 4 minutes. See if I can do it before we have a little break. So there's 3 levels of analysis that I think we need to go at. One is the really, really wide, deep dive. So the first part of that, I think, there's multiple elements that I'll miss off, but first part of that is we've moved from pre-enlightenment thinking. I'm going right back now. Pre-enlightenment, where God was what made the world tick, to understanding something about science and knowing that there's physics and chemistry and whatever. Part of that process has been what we call the medicalization of society, where when we have a problem, we look for a medical solution. A part of that is drugs. So we look for drugs as the answer. And you know, you hear it all the time, right? With I need to lose some weight, give me the fat loss pills, go. That's an example of it. So that's one thing we've got, one building block of our explanation. The next one is, in life broadly, you've got to perform. We don't call it that. We talking about as success or work ethic, but in sport, bodybuilding, or whatever, you have to specifically perform. Sport, obviously, you've got to win. That's the goal. In bodybuilding, you've got to win through a different goal. You've got to get the aesthetic look. It's still about performance. So there's another thing. So we've now got medicine, and we've got performance as a real focus for people in life. Throw into that mix images of what's healthy, how we look at a healthy body, and what a healthy body or even an attractive body looks like. Throw that in. Now throw into that mix influencers. One of my favorite topics, fitness influencers. Probably very good genetics, potentially steroid enhanced. Neither of those things are talked about, but their bodies are the things that people will necessarily aspire to. So what have we got now? We've got this lad who comes to me, knows to look for medicine or drugs as a solution to stuff, wants to perform better, and probably wants to look like those people look. So that's your kind of broad context. Does that make a bit of sense as a start point?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then from there, we have to move on to a slightly less broad context and come in a little bit into the subculture or the community or the network of people that people are connected to. So that kid clearly has got no network that he can speak to if he's coming to me. He's not searching stuff out on the internet. So his kind of access to drugs is quite limited. Same as in the boxing gym. Same things apply, but now we're in a boxing gym where drugs are bad. Broadly speaking, all drugs are bad. They don't even like getting people doing protein. They still think that's, and creatine's obviously a steroid. So drugs are bad. Less than a minute left. So in this subculture, we've got these kind of issues. So the subculture mediates all those bigger issues. Now we've got the individual factors. The individual factors come in. Is this person a second team player who wants to be in the first team? Is this person desperate to be an athlete? Those sort of factors. Has this person got nothing else going on in their lives? Now we start to see the sort of person, those contexts, with the right people to mediate them into drug use or to bodybuilding. They're the people that probably get drawn in. What I wanted to do with that was to kind of, because Rick's podcast was an interesting discussion and we went over some points and whatnot. And I think that was good for getting just people to kind of generally think with social science and to think critically about the kind of world that we're in to some degree. But what I think, what I tried to do there is try and give you guys, coaches who are listening, an understanding of who might be the sort of person who's at risk. Who's the person who who's the person that's going to potentially do stuff that they shouldn't do? And by that, I don't mean I'm being like, oh, you shouldn't do drugs. No, as I've said in Rick's podcast, I'm broadly pro-drugs, think we should have a liberal kind of approach to drugs. It's that if people are going to do drugs, they've got to understand the risks and stuff. And that's the people that I think are the problem. So this lad, go back to this lad again, you know, he's not willing to go and listen to Dave Crossland talk about some stuff, some basic stuff about steroids, but he wants to do it. He's clearly got some physique motivations. Why, I don't know. Combine those two things, a real kind of drive to change his body shape and a inability or an unwillingness to go and seek out basic training information. That's a heady mix of get fucked up.
Yeah. Selfishly, this is quite interesting to me because, or maybe not selfishly, because through quarantine, I started my website and I started writing articles and putting them out and stuff. And the main driver was, how can I present something that is applicable to people like this person you're talking about, that reaches out to me? I want to take this drug, that drug, but how can I put information across in a way that, so my goals have been to make each article as short as possible, keep all the science out as much as possible, make everything as basic as possible, and have it all on a backbone of a safer use model, so to speak. But I don't know if it's even working, because my degree of questions to Instagram hasn't changed in magnitude or number, you know?
Sorry, my computer's just melted down slightly. So the issue, I think, there is not what you're doing. I think I've read a few of those, and I think you've nailed it. Where the issue is
I don't think we read them. Like
the people who need to read them aren't going to read them. The people who want to be reconfirmed that they should eat dark chocolate are going to read them. The people who are really keen on
doesn't answer their question in the way that they were hoping it would. I think
it's that like preconceived bias, you know.
The issue is not those people. The thing is, you like I said to Austin before we got on, like I seek this stuff out. I understand some of this stuff. When I'm hearing you guys talk about stuff, I'm learning some stuff because I'm not an expert in the kind of physiology of it and a few other bits and bobs. But I know enough because I did a sports science degree, and I can think a bit myself to understand it and engage with it. What we've got is a whole chunk of people who don't even know what they don't know. So where do they go? They don't go to read your blog post that makes sense to someone who understands a bit. They go to XYZ dude on YouTube with abs, whose videos are all with abs out. And I'm not talking about Jeff Cavalier here, although it sounds like I am, because Jeff Cavalier stuff is usually quite good. I mean, as they go, as people who film stuff with their tops off, Jeff Cavalier is probably one of the better ones. But
he's under recent scrutiny, isn't he?
Say again.
He's been under scrutiny recently because he got caught fake plate.
Oh, the fake weights, yeah.
Oh no, did he? Oh, Jeff.
No, I was upset when I found out. I thought he was one of the genuine guys.
But there's so many people who are so there's like I don't say uneducated in a mean way. I mean literally uneducated in this stuff. They might have a PhD, but they don't know anything about training. But they want to get bigger and stronger or whatever they want to do. And they're not willing to go and do that bit of understanding and get that understanding. And everyone thinks training is simple. And in one respect, it is super simple. Lift some weights, eat well. But the nuances in there are quite complicated. And then people don't understand that after that first 6 months, it's going to get hard. And I reckon this lad was probably about 6 months to a year in training. And he'd made some gains and he'd slowed down. So his motion was, as I said earlier, drugs is the answer, because we've moved into this world where drugs is the answer. I've got to get better. Who can I ask? So I think that the issue, we have to just, to answer the question, we have to go back wide again. And you're doing your bit. I think both of you are doing your bit very well. I think there's other people who do stuff really well in terms of educating people. But it's not you that's the issue. It's society in a broad sense. To tackle this, we need to have a better way of helping people understand physiology, whether that's in gyms, or at school better and people concentrate at school more? I don't know. The answer isn't that simple. I'm sure there's people who have researched this stuff who have given. My dog is coming. Here she comes.
We get the dog on cam. I want to see the dog.
Oh gosh. Come here then. Up. Oh, she's a puppy. She's have to tilt.
Yeah.
There she is.
Oh.
She's a golden retriever. Then this is Bonnie here. Come here. Oh, you didn't like that, did you? All right. She's a nightmare of a woman. Anyway, this is that.
Golden retriever. That's just the best.
She's
dog.
cracky. Yeah, she's amazing. She's perfect. Right. Chill now. Where was that? Yeah. So I think the bigger issue is these kind of these large what we call social processes, that we have these issues around people wanting to look a certain way, that people reach for drugs, that people aren't willing to read and take stuff in, and they don't necessarily have the knowledge to know where they should be looking in the first place. So when I got back into training, when I finished boxing, how old am I now? So I think 36, I finished boxing. I'm not taking another sport up at 36. I've already got knackered knees, back into training, back into lifting. And I knew enough to know that when I was watching Steve Hall's Revive Stronger podcast, I was going to learn some stuff. I was going to learn a bit more about volume and the advances that I'd missed in the 10 years that I'd not been training in a gym, but been boxing or whatever, I could catch up with. And I had that. I knew what to seek out. I'm not special. I've just got a little bit of knowledge. That knowledge is what gets people to know that you guys know what you're on about, and to ignore the people who are the snake oil salesmen, the bullshitters, the people who are just wrong, the people who are, you know, who's the one that Broderick Chavez always disses? Dave Palumbo. He always hammers Dave Palumbo. And I love hearing him talking about Dave Palumbo. I don't know who he is. Obviously, I wouldn't watch his stuff because it sounds like it's a load of rubbish. But anyway, my answer is it's not an answer, is it? It's not an answer. What do I do? I think what you do is what you're already doing. I think you're doing your best. You can't change the society, unfortunately. We need a big community-wide change, and I think to a degree that's happened actually. You know, we've moved that way a bit, haven't we?
Yeah, this is like, Joe, dude, this is something I've struggled with so bad because there's so many things wrong with this equation. For one, like you said, people don't even know what they're looking for to begin with. They don't even know. And Joe, like me, I think we both do a pretty good job of taking advanced information, but bringing it down to an understandable level like that anyone could read it. But the problem is people don't know what to seek out because, for one, we aren't as loud and clickbaity as these, as these other sources. We're not necessarily, we market in a realistic way. Here's the information. Here's what we provide to you. Not like this is going to give you this X result overnight. You need this to grow your biceps or whatever. Like, that's not how we present the information. So it's difficult, but at the same time, there is some advantage to that because, if you take some of those YouTube videos that might get a lot of hits, or Facebook posts or Instagram posts, they might get one out of every 1,000 hits that actually converts in anything meaningful. Whereas every person that reads what we put out is getting something out of it because, we're just attracting people that are genuinely going to take it to heart. They're going to read it, and they're going to understand it, and they're going to use it. So I think like the actual turnover rate of success is probably more than what you see on the surface. It's just that I totally get I get the dilemma there, but like you said, I do think we have slowly shifted towards. There's another problem though. We have slowly shifted towards this more being conscious of good information and putting out good information. But now I'm also seeing this so often that there's people that don't know what they're talking about that are throwing out these catchwords like, let's talk about insulin sensitivity and inflammation and this and that, but they don't actually know what these concepts are. They're just talking about it because that's what people want to know about. So now it's like, so we've got a lot going on.
Yeah. Do you think this inability to recognize good information from bad, maybe does it stem back to the way that we're educated in the West? our education system.
Yes, I mean, just basic critical thinking is really lacking in most spaces, and that's one of the reasons why I still feel that university education still has a place, because of that broad. I've had people who have talked to me about how their university was a complete waste of time, and then you ask them about critical thinking, and they're like, "Oh shit, that's where I learned that," and they think they've like got that naturally. It's like, yeah, I understand that you don't use the XYZ theory of whatever anymore. Fine, no one does, but you do know how to write better. You do know how to think better, and those sort of things are what we still do quite well. Two more points on that. One is, as I said, I think you guys are already doing it, and there's other people doing it. Give Rick his credit as well. Doing supplements that are focused on health. That's great. Does it on purpose, makes money out of it. Good. And the way I think you guys and the rest of the community could just think about that, and you probably do this anyway, but is basically make the world a better place than when you came into it. In some respect, if you do that, you've done your bit. That's kind of a nice one for you guys to think about, but it's not going to tackle the social issue, I don't think. The way that one model that we can think of for the broader thing is the model that sport has. Now, I spend my career critiquing sport, but there's some stuff that it does quite well. One is it has governing bodies. Now, there's no governing body here. There's federations for bodybuilding, but that's not a governing body. Governing body literally governs. It has a coaching manual. It has coaching badges. It has, I do a bit of work with England Boxing. I sit on their disciplinary panels. When someone does something they shouldn't do, they get drawn up in front of the disciplinary panel. So when we have these kind of fitness coaches that are saying a load of nonsense, if there was a governing body, that nonsense would get cut out.
There's a lack of accountability in our industry, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, how would you even go about doing that? I mean,
there's also, and like I say this, fully aware of, this is my problem. Me and my wife talk about this a lot, because I actually didn't do that good education. I actually haven't got any education. She's higher educated. And people, I often get that where people use a confirmation with like, oh yes, you know, it just shows you don't need university. I'm like, no, you're looking at this backwards, because it took me maybe 7 years to learn to read studies properly. I could have probably done it in one if I'd have gone to university, but I was an ape when I was 18 and I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
And I made a poor decision. Don't idolize people that didn't get educated, because I fundamentally regret getting a higher level of education.
Sorry, guys.
Laughing at us. We've lost him.
I think this, when it comes into coaching, and that, you know, I'm a coach. I make my living off of coaching, and I do consultations every day with people, but I have no qualification, and actually, I think that's a problem.
Yeah. So there's another problem. One of Robert Dingwalls, who works with me on a PhD, is a bit of a mentor for me. When I wrote a paper with a colleague of mine, Alex Channon, we were talking about medical supervision of combat sports. Very similar. No governing body. Medical supervision is all over the place. There's usually some, and it's all over the place. And we're basically saying it needs to be regulated. And he was like, whoa, be careful what you wish for when you start wishing for regulation. It's something it's a double-edged sword for sure. So, but then there's the individual element to this, isn't there? That I think you're right. You might have speeded up when you were at university. You might not. If I'd gone to university at 18, I would have been out after 6 months. No chance I would have been able to do it. I still stuffed it up when I went in my mid-20s. I just wasn't ready. But also, I know people who have gone to university. I probably taught a few who are going to come out of university with very poor education, and they expect that people are going to respect them because of it. It's like, whoa! You do not understand this topic, and you're now expecting a graduate job. Like that's equally not as good, if not worse. So the kind of educational standards can't be linked to university as some inherent good. That's for sure. You can definitely be far more educated than someone who's not gone to university. Definitely, might be a little bit of hard work in some respects. I don't know, but also those sort of people, and talking specifically about you, they're relatively unique. To get to your level of understanding about a complex academic topic without going to university is relatively unique. So then you have to factor that into
the coaches that do talk about PD use very openly, which is the crux here.
Yeah.
And that you'll have a few unique people that can self-learn. You know, that's something that I do put time into every day. I'm trying not to make this like talking about myself, because that's not the point here, although I'm using myself as an example. There are plenty of people in our industry. In fact, coaches are a dime a dozen, as you know. And drug use comes hand in hand with the sport, like we spoke about. And now you've got just about anybody talking about drugs that can have these potential great magnitude of effective deleterious health issues, you know?
Yeah.
What do we do?
I think another issue too is that anytime you're putting out something that's slightly different or slightly ahead of the curve, you're always going to have less understanding or possible scrutiny or things like that, you know, because it's not necessarily anything that's like, you know, anytime someone breaks out. Okay, I'll give you an easy example. So let's talk about any type of subject that came into the bodybuilding realm that was probably true but wasn't received very well. So fasting. Remember when fasting came in, all these bodybuilders said, fasting's the dumbest thing ever. There's no way a bodybuilder can ever fast. They're going to wither away and lose all their muscle. And then all of a sudden, everyone was talking about how the different ways you could benefit from fasting and implement fasting and doing all these things. And there's a million examples like that, you know. So if you talk about something that's maybe a little bit cutting edge or a little bit advanced and not necessarily the norm, I don't think it matters how you present it. I think there's always going to be some level of disconnect with people, you know, until it starts to become more accepted. Like there's things I've maybe talked about 2 or 3 years ago that people came back and they said, oh, I watched this video and I'm understanding what you're talking about now. I'm like, yeah, you know, because more people started to maybe bring it up and talk about it. And I'm not saying that I'm like cutting edge, because there's other people that have put stuff out that was way ahead of the time. But you get my example. There's always going to be some disconnect if you're not following the normal, the norm, I guess.
What about going the opposite way, which is a friend of mine's got a really bad back, and the doctors went straight to all the opioids to help him. And I sent him a message first off, which was, and I, as I said, I'm no expert in this stuff. I just know things from like following podcasts and listening to people. I've heard people talk about BP 600, BP 500s.
B157.
There you go. Yeah. There you go. And growth hormone. And I know that there's ways in which those things could be used as a protocol to help someone recover from something. I don't know enough about it, but I said, why don't you look into this? Obviously, he's not, because why would you do this? He should, but he wouldn't. But where would he go to? The GP that's giving him the opioids. Then I find out he's worried about losing some muscle mass, and they've not, because he's basically lying on his back, and the GP has not said to him, you know, here's how you hold on to whatever muscle mass you've got. He's basically boozing, which I'm down with, and that's what I'd do if I was lying on my back a lot, probably. Because he's down and he's struggling, and then, well, I don't know if he's down, probably not, but he's boozing. We all like to booze anyway. You probably don't, but I do. And so he's probably struggling in that respect. He's lost his appetite, so he's not eating. And I'm like, here's a prime example here. You're not moving, you're drinking booze, and you're not eating enough. That's how you're going to lose your muscle mass. And he was like, oh, thanks for that. Also, I'll drink a bit less. And I was like, right, get 4 protein feeds in the day. Make sure you're in a calorie surplus. If you put a bit of fat on, don't worry about it. It'll come off. So, oh yeah, wicked, yeah. That's basic training knowledge. Not even on the agenda from the GP or whoever's seeing him, let alone healing peptides. Like, I mean, all this stuff that within the bodybuilding community would be like, right, you're injured, here you go. Here's your protocol. It hasn't.
It's an authority of information, isn't it? Who is the authority? I had this with my dad, because my dad had back surgery a couple of years ago that left him paralyzed from the waist down, and he was in he had you know, to the degree that me and my wife had to move in with him to care for him for a long time. And he was prescribed, again, opioids, diazepam, and etc. And I was saying, Dad, look at this and look at this, because it was a nerve problem. I was saying, I've got all these, printing off these neuropathy studies for him, and I put it all in a folder, and we all of this information. He's like, no, he doesn't consider my information.
Yeah.
And isn't that interesting? Because to him, I'm not an authority of information.
Yeah.
I'm not a reliable source of information.
Yeah. And the clues in the name the clues in the name with the general. Go on,
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was
just going to say that there's also like there's also like a whole multitude of people out there that aren't an authority and jack shit, and people still listen to them. Yeah. You know what I mean? So again, I think it comes down to, a lot of that comes down to who's the loudest, and who talks the loudest, who has the best marketing, like you said, who's showing their abs in their YouTube video. I mean, I swear that it boils down to what you'd said earlier about just lack of understanding of how to find and understand information that's good and information that's bullshit, right? And it's interesting because sometimes I'll run into people that they have no knowledge of anything that we're doing, and they had seen like videos or read articles or something, and then they read my information. They said, well, yours makes a lot more sense than theirs. And I'm like, well, that's, and that's interesting to me, because that's purely that's like a critical thinking skill that they have. It has nothing to do with their base of information, because they don't know anything about bodybuilding. They read two sources of info. One made a lot of sense to them and one didn't. And that's a skill that a lot of people just don't have,
Just a couple of points on that. One, I think a good resource is something Mike Israetel wrote about critical thinking. I think he just wrote it about critical thinking. I don't think he even applied it to bodybuilding. So if people want to go into seek that out, that's great. The other thing, I think what I tend to do with the students, and I get a lot of the students to follow bodybuilding as a subculture. One, because it's interesting, because you can hear like horrific stories of people doing kind of crazy shit, which makes people go, oh, wow. And then you've got a teaching thing. You catch somebody's attention. But the other thing is that, like you said earlier, the people are doing stuff that's at the forefront, the avant-garde of sports performance. And these kids are going to go into sport for the next X years, 40 years. So the stuff that you guys have been doing for the last 10 years and talking about health, well-being, training is probably going to filter in different ways. So I get them to kind of look at that, but try and get them to give them that critical eye. One, is there some research for it? And I don't mean research as in papers. Yes, it'd be great if there are papers, but is there strong anecdotal research as well? Is this someone who can genuinely say that this isn't just like one thing? This has been looked at deeply. But second, and this is the key that I always try and come back to, is the mechanism. Can the person who's talking to you about this thing explain the mechanism? Can they say, this happens in this way and it does it for this reason? And if they can do that, well, that makes sense. Like you just said, Austin, that makes sense. Right. That mechanism, A goes to B, goes to C, and you get D. Well, okay, brilliant. Now I can follow. And this goes back to famous physicist Richard Feynman. That's his basic way of teaching and understanding. Is if you can't explain it, you don't understand it. And these people, one thing to really cool bullshit on them is, can they explain the mechanism? If they can't, that's fair enough. Shut up, go and read about it, come back when you can. That's fair enough, I think, if people are putting public information out.
There's a lot of because there's a lot of regurgitation of things, and and it's easy to, and I think for us, do you understand the mechanism, but do you also understand how it actually applies to our population? Like what's the context? So like I do these whiteboard videos and stuff, and I'll talk about a topic and I'll draw like a diagram or something, but then I also say, let me give you an example. If this and this and this, and of course that doesn't solve everyone's problem, and that's not my intent, but my point is that this is how this actually looks in real life, right? Yeah. This is what this looks like. So, and that's something that Joe and I do a lot on here. And unfortunately, like there are tons of people out there that are really good at searching PubMed and finding something that confirms their preconceived bias and posting it, and then that's it, and they leave it at that, and they say this is what you should do because here is my study, and then that's it. And they have experience with like 5 people. So it's tough, man. This is a tough topic, because this shit drives me crazy. Trying to
fascinating though, isn't it, to look at human behavior like that?
Yeah.
It drives that human behavior. I find that really interesting.
So one more example that I kind of touched on earlier, like that notion of, when people on really strong antiretrovirals, they often prescribe anabolic steroids at the same time to help them keep muscle mass on. So that's a thing that has been used. That's kind of a bit of an exception, because largely those sort of drugs and other drugs, recreational drugs, because of the stigma that's attached to them, there's barely any research. So the 3 examples that I was thinking of earlier, and this is why I was thinking about this kind of medicalization of society and stuff. We've medicalized the world as much as we can, but it's not level. It's not all medicines to always make people as good as possible, because there's stigma attached to drugs, but there's only certain drugs. So a great example is the early research on acid, completely knocked out the window because the hippies started using it, and it became stigmatized, and they stopped it. Now all of the science that could have been done, and it's recently, well, it's not even recent now, but the last 20 or 30 years, started back up again. All of the science that has been lost to time because they didn't do the work on microdosing or even big dosing for depression, bringing people out of depression, thinking in different ways. I've used acid in big and small doses to help me think, literally to help me get out of a place where I couldn't get through an academic idea, and it's been breakthroughs for me. All that's lost. Ecstasy, that was originally used for marriage counselling, and some of my best experiences in life and connections with people have been on ecstasy. Fundamentally changed me as a person and made me a better person doing ecstasy. I mean, it also hurt me the next couple of days afterwards, but my word, the best friendships I've ever made have been through that drug. And then one that I don't have knowledge of, but is ketamine, one for helping with depression. It's another one which is, there's work on that now, but those drugs, stigmatized, the research isn't done properly. And we that stigmatization, that drives me insane. And it's the same with this world that we're talking about here, like you talked about natural bodybuilders. Oh, I'd never touch a drug. Oh my God, I can't do that. But it's going to make you healthy. It's going to help you. What happens if you need this just to be normal? Oh no, because I'm natural. Yeah, well, good luck getting out of bed. So we have these things that are locked inside us, and this is the way that it's right. This is wrong. That's moralistically, that's bad. And that's something that we learn over time. And we need to be able to think through that. Look at the data. What is this drug doing? Is it killing people? Right. Okay. Let's stay away from that one. What's this drug doing? Is it helping people get through depression? Possibly. Right. Let's do more work on it. Instead of going, it's acid, you can't do it.
That's like a risk, just like a risk analysis. I mean, it's.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be great if everything was done that way? But it's not. It's done with politics and morals a lot of the time.
Well, I think humans very often have emotional responses to ideas that disagree with their own.
Yeah.
And that's one of the worst ways to live, I think, having like an emotional response to something that I think it's prevalent in religion, isn't it?
Yeah.
When presented with evidence to the contrary of what you believe, you react emotionally and not rationally. And when you bring that into the science realm and into the coaching realm, into the bodybuilding realm, you get disaster.
Yes, totally.
People that aren't the same people that go, Psalms, no, not interested. Hold on. Yeah, we might not be there yet. The Ostarine trials, they did fail when the dose was escalated above the tissue selective nature of the drug. Yes, fair enough. But does that mean we just ignore every single Psalm ever? Because if non-steroidal Psalms were perfect, they'd be the best drug ever in bodybuilding. And it's like just disregarding any idea,
Yeah, and a good way of thinking about this, and I think it's a useful one, because all of these ideas, the problem is that when we study this stuff, is that how do you reflect on yourself to see what your own biases are? Because you're in them, It's like trying to see in your own brain. I can't turn my eyes around to see them. One way is to try and visualize what that is. Someone else's idea, Alex Channon, my colleague from University of Brighton, who I work with, he talks about ideology, which is what you're talking about, ideological thinking. And his example is when you have police horses. When police horses go to a football game, they have the blinkers on so that it stops them from seeing all the mess, the stuff that's getting thrown at them, the people that are rioting. And it just helps them to stay focused in one place. And the copper who's controlling them keeps them focused in that one place. And an ideology does that. It makes you see only these things. So here's the thing that's confirming what I want it to confirm. Here's the thing, right? I keep looking at that, keep confirming it. But there's 4 or 5 different things happening here which don't confirm it. I can't see them because of my ideology. It's so damaging. We see it with politics. We see it with religion. We're seeing it with COVID. I mean, America is rife with it, right? We're following very quickly with this left-right agenda that is just so painful, where people are getting hammered just because, like, so what was the thing that Donald Trump did recently that was right? He did something right, and the left couldn't let him have it.
No, dude.
I hate the guy.
He can't do anything right.
No,
according to them.
Exactly. He can't do literally nothing. Like, no observable thing that he could ever do correct. Granted, mostly he does bad stuff. But what was it? It was the lockdown. That was it. He stopped people coming in from China or something around there. He didn't do it well. He didn't do it properly. But he did it earlier than the left thought he should. And they wouldn't let him have it. It's like, okay, sometimes bad people do good things. Sometimes things happen outside of your ideological worldview that you have to accept. You have to bring it into understanding the world better.
That's
so
a good point.
important for bodybuilding. So important for all sports and just living a good life.
That's a good point, because what bodybuilders do as well, they don't only react emotionally to things that disagree with their ideology, but they also criticize other people when they are open to change their ideology.
Yeah. How crazy.
I'm sure you've had that, Austin. I get that all the time. It's like, yeah, but a few years ago you said this and now you're saying this. I'm like, yeah, because I've found new evidence.
Yeah.
And
right. Or I found a better way to do something.
Yeah.
Heaven forbid, right? That we change something. And it's like, and I think that you should be that way, because that shows good character in terms of you're always learning and interpreting new information. And there's very little chance. And, with bodybuilding, there are things that work. There are ideas that people used 50 years ago that if you still did them, they're probably going to work to some extent, right? They did then, they probably will now. But if we found something better, there's no reason to scrutinize someone because they found something better or new or safer, maybe, or whatever it might be. I mean, it's crazy. And then if you leave your camp and you give a different idea, then, oh my, you're going to get torn down.
Yeah, you're a traitor. I'm funny enough, I'm writing about this at the minute. I'm just coming to the end of basically a decade of boxing research. So I'm trying to pull it all together into a book. And one of the things that I'm kind of writing about is theoretical determinism, which is very similar to what we're talking about. Like, here's my theory. I see that in the data. Therefore, I write my data in a certain way. It happens a lot in social science. And one of the phrases, I forget who now, I think it might have been Howard Becker. He said, who's a very famous sociologist from America, I think he said, I shouldn't attribute this to him if he didn't say it, it's impossible to learn something you already know. The notion being that if you think you know something, you stop looking for other ways to learn about it. It's just done. I already know that. I know how to train.
Yeah.
I'm done. And that closed-mindedness. And, if somebody's 60, 70, fair enough. You've lived a life. You know what you know. Fair play. Go for it. But people in our generation and the younger generation, you've got to do the opposite. You've got to know that you don't know. You've got to understand that you're wrong. You've got to be looking for the way in which you can be correct. Yeah,
exactly. I always find that the more I learn about any subject, the more I realize how little I actually know about it.
Yeah, there you go. That's it. That's exactly it.
Yeah. I question things all the time. And that's like when I put out information, there's things I intentionally leave out because there's so much room for context and additional insight. It's just, there's a lot out there, and we're never going to know everything. So, you know, like you said, it's, if you go into every situation thinking you already know the answer, then you're never going to learn. You won't. There's no way. I mean, I've even picked up little things with some of the guests that we've had on, and something that I thought I probably knew, and then I heard something like, oh, that's, you know, that's, or something different, or a different way to look at things. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think if you're, especially in art, like what Joe and I do, if you're servicing, you're providing a service, it's a disservice to never get any better and never, never improve. Yeah, I mean, it's, this whole idea, this whole discussion on information and interpretation of information and learning is something that I think about a lot. It's a really tough topic because, like I said before, it's always hard to be a little ahead of the curve and different. It's always going to be tough.
Yeah. One of the best things about bodybuilding, just this might be a good way to kind of start tying it up, is that you can do a little bit of that learning, and then you can try it out. Like, does this training method work? Like, I've recently discovered that I just really dropped my volume down, and I've made some really good progress. Previously, I'd made some really good progress on higher volume, and the shift between the two has been really useful. It's like, oh, obviously, of course it has, because I've got a new stimulus, a different stimulus, and all the rest of it. So you can look at this, understand it, and then try it out. And people don't seem to be willing to try it out. Why would you not try it out? Even if that's 6 months, let's say 6 months is like subpar training. So what? So what? Like, even 6 months, that's no big deal for most of us. You know, I'm talking about just a general kind of gym guy and whatever. But anyway, whatever.
That's interesting. I'm just doing exactly that myself. Like, for the first time in years, trying a higher volume training model, just because I need to gather evidence based on some new data that I read about delayed hypertrophy from Damas et al. So, definitely be open to new ideas. Yeah, we'll wrap it up here anyway. But Chris, that was awesome, man. I really enjoyed that discussion. It might be cool if we could actually, if I could ask any listeners here, if they maybe have some kind of discussion along these topics that they'd like to hear, if we could get you back on and cover some listener.
Yeah, if we get a few Q&A sort of things, if you have some questions, I can give them some thought, and then just, I mean, I can't promise to answer them, but I can promise to think about them differently. Yeah,
I think that's what these podcasts are going to do, get people thinking about the way that they think and the way that they act. And, and I think that's what's most valuable here. Anyway, it's about to cut us off. So, Chris, tell us where we can find all your stuff.
Immersiveresearch.co.uk.
Cool. That'll be in the show notes below. I'll tag Chris and everything. Please check out the sponsors. Thank you guys for listening. Tag us in the stories and all that. And we'll catch you guys next week. Thank you.